Chair had the call. Yes, a little bit of time remaining. I don't see him seeking the call. Jacinda Ardern.
It's my pleasure to take my first call on part 3 of this bill, and I just want to, before commencing, hark back to the contribution made by my colleague John Hayes, who seems to really resent the fact that the opposition is exploring some of the detail of this bill in the committee stages, as it is imperative, I think, that we do. And my colleague Elise Galloway has, I think, described him as being, was it monosyllabic in his contribution. I do think, though, that if we distill down what my colleague's John Hayes' contribution on part 3 was I think if he had his way, this bill would simply state, part 1, let's have a party commencement date now. Because he seems to utterly reject the notion that we should have any discussion around procedurally the way that some of the details around the Rugby World Cup should be dealt with. And we see this as quite an important job on our side of the House, and one which we will continue to undertake with vigour. But when it comes to part 3, this is actually a really important substantive part of the bill, because the whole intention, of course, is that this bill balance the need to reduce down any delay in time and unnecessary bureaucracy, but still make sure that due process is undertaken when granting the authority to undertake certain activities that would otherwise go through quite a rigorous procedure. And getting that balance right is absolutely critical, and a lot of that occurs to a certain degree in part 3. Now, my colleague Chris Hipkins has already outlined some of the timelines that may be applied to certain applications under this part. And I think his rough estimation was that at its longest point we may, for instance, see delays of an application which had public notification perhaps attached to it of roughly 25 working days. Now, with the Rugby World Cup being in such a short time, even the longest process that we might see could be perceived to be an impediment to undertaking a particular activity. And so I wondered whether or not the government or the Select Committee, if any Select Committee members wish to contribute on this question, or perhaps if the Minister and the Chair, Honourable Judith Collins, wish to take a call, because I note that no calls have been taken by ministers in the Chair, which is disappointing up until this point. But it would be useful if the Minister could perhaps outline to us the longest period at which they anticipate a application being processed. How long do they anticipate the longest application process taking? It would be useful to understand that from the government's perspective, because, for instance, is it intended that this ministerial power for unforeseen circumstances, for which the government's unable to explain to us what that might look like, could be used to override, for instance, a process which is taking too long under the jurisdiction of the authority? Is that the intention, or does that fall outside the ambit of what they anticipate that extraordinary ministerial power being used for? Some clarification on that point would be useful. I think it's interesting to reflect in under Part 3, Section 19, 2C, goes into some of the additional requirements that are being set out, I think specifically clarified by the Select Committee, that an application going through this shortened process must include, which is specific to the Rugby World Cup. And that includes, for instance, information as to the steps the applicant will take to ensure, as far as reasonably practical, health and safety is carried out, maps and plans of the location, any conditions the applicant considers appropriate for the declaration, a few things that are specific to the Rugby World Cup. Now, again, I just want to reflect on the fact that the Select Committee has split out in its definition the notion of tournament events, so the actual sporting events themselves, from ancillary events. So, for instance, the public screening of an event in a public place, or, for instance, an additional liquor licence for a pub in a remote area to extend its usual licence requirements to screen an event. I'd be interested if the Minister could clarify whether or not there is any perceived difference in the application process that either of those. Mr. Chair. Oh, thank you, Mr. Chair. Whether or not it's anticipated that we split out in the way that those are dealt with by the authority, because that's something that, although I concede I'm new to looking at this particular piece of legislation, it's something that's not entirely clear to me on a cursory glance. Then I want to specifically come to 21A, which deals with overlapping applications between the bodies, the statutory bodies who would otherwise usually in a routine way deal with the applications which now the authority, the Rugby World Cup authority, will deal with in a circumvented process. Now I think it's right that we have quite clear procedural direction as to what happens when we have duplicate applications through either of those bodies, but I still have some question marks over, for instance, arbitration, those who have a higher delegation of power between those two bodies. So I just want to raise those. So under 21A it states that if there are overlapping bodies and the same or substantially the same as an application already lodged with a statutory body or person, the application to the relevant statutory person or body is to be treated as having been withdrawn from the relevant statutory person or body and must be transferred to the authority in accordance with the regulation made under this Act. And I guess I just wondered that it is quite a significant power to basically instruct that a relevant statutory body must, and then under 4A it states, without delay, forward a copy of all documentation it holds on the application to the authority and cease to process the application. Now I wondered, in this scenario, for instance, where there might be some question over whether or not the application fulfills the criteria set out here, or a statutory body may have some jurisdiction questions and wishes to maintain the processing of that application, is there any arbitration that can take place in that kind of dispute? Because we are talking about overriding probably what otherwise might be local council authority, quite significant powers in that regard. But I do want to congratulate whether it be the Select Committee or the Government, who have anticipated this issue and tried its best to resolve it, because it does seem curious that they've anticipated this issue but can't anticipate the circumstances which carte blanche powers for a minister might be required. It is hard to imagine what kind of scenario they're wishing to anticipate. And then they refer to Part 6 under the same area, where it says that the statutory time limits applying to the relevant statutory person or body recommence from the date that the statutory body or person receives the documentation. So, for instance, if an authority declines an application under its criteria for processing, for instance, a liquor licence, and then refers it back to the usual statutory body who processes it, that relevant statutory body must treat the decision and reasons of the authority as irrelevant for the purpose of the decision on the application. So it does seem to me that although there is no judicial oversight to challenge a decision made by an authority, we do have a backstop measure here where basically someone who's making an application could just go back to the statutory body, make the application again, have it processed in time for the Rugby World Cup, and still come out with the relevant requirements and legal rights to proceed, even though an authority with plenty jurisdiction has already made that decision otherwise. So I'm interested in if the committee or the government could share its rationale. Perhaps the Minister and the Chair might like to tell us why the authority's decision is not full and final, and we still have, in a sense, an additional judicial process, in a sense, that someone can then go through. So an extra layer of bureaucracy, really. Curious as to why those decisions are not full and final, and that actually we're leaving at the end of the day potentially local authorities to be a final arbiter, and I wonder if that was the intention of the government. So some clarification of that would be good. It's still Jackie Dean.